The night it began, the house was filled with small sounds that no one else would have noticed. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the old clock above the mantel, and the soft creak of the front door, closing a few seconds later than it should have. I was in the kitchen rinsing a glass when the faint trace of perfume drifted past me, too sharp, too floral to be mine. It was the same perfume I'd smelled at the last neighborhood gathering when my friend Tessa had hugged me a little too tightly and laughed a little too long at Mark's jokes. That single note of fragrance clung to the air like a confession, and in that moment, something inside me shifted. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was the first undeniable sign that the life I thought was steady was beginning to crack. Before I continue, let me pause for a moment. If you've ever felt the weight of betrayal, you'll understand why I'm sharing this. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more true family stories about love, lies, and justice. My name is Elena Brooks, and for most of my life, I believed in stability above all else. I grew up in a modest home in the Midwest where my father worked long hours at a factory and my mother balanced part-time jobs with raising 3 kids. They taught me the value of showing up every day even when it was hard. That became my compass guiding me through college into my career as a school counselor, and later into the marriage I built with Mark. He was steady on the surface, successful in a way my family admired, and he had a way of making people feel like he carried the whole world on his back without complaint. Together, we raised our daughter Lily in a brick colonial that always smelled faintly of coffee and clean laundry, a home that was supposed to be safe. On the outside, we were the kind of family people waved to on Sunday mornings. Mark's career in regional sales meant long hours and constant travel. But it also paid for vacations, private music lessons for Lily, and dinners at restaurants my parents would have considered a luxury. I carried the quieter role, keeping Lily grounded, maintaining friendships, making sure the family rhythm stayed smooth. Our circle included neighbors, colleagues, and one of my closest friends, Tessa, who had been part of my life since college. She was bright, magnetic, and always seemed to know how to turn any gathering into an event. I trusted her the way you trust someone who has seen you through your awkward years and stood beside you at your wedding. But harmony has a way of hiding fractures. As the years passed, I began to notice subtle shifts, Mark's jokes directed more often at Tessa, her hand brushing his arm in casual conversation, the way she'd ask me about his travel schedule with a little too much interest. I told myself I was imagining it, that after nearly 2 decades of marriage, I was just being overly cautious. Still, the perfume that night stayed with me, winding around my thoughts like smoke I couldn't wave away. I wanted to believe in the picture we'd painted together, the one of laughter around the dinner table of Lily planning for college, with 2 proud parents supporting her every step. But deep down, I knew something was brewing beneath the surface. Something that would demand I choose between denial and truth. As I stood in the kitchen that evening, the scent still lingering in the air, I realized that the story I thought I was living might not be mine at all. And that was the moment I began to see, quietly, painfully, that the life I had trusted was only a stage, and the real performance was happening behind the curtain. The days that followed the faint trace of perfume in my kitchen were filled with unease I couldn't quite shake. At school, I found myself distracted during meetings, my thoughts circling back to the silence of that night and the door closing later than it should have. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, telling myself Mark was simply caught up in work, that my imagination was inventing shadows. Yet each time I convinced myself of that, something else chipped away at the picture I was trying to preserve. Mark began coming home later than usual, his excuses rehearsed and strangely polished. Client dinner ran long, or the flight was delayed again, became his regular refrains, spoken with a casual tone that didn't match the tension in his eyes. I'd ask simple questions. What client, which flight? And he would answer too quickly, like someone reading from a script. Even his clothes betrayed him. Crisp collars carried faint scents of perfume that were not mine, and sometimes faint smudges of makeup brushed the edges of his shirt. Small signs, but they stacked up one on top of the other until they became impossible to ignore. At the time, Tessa remained one of my closest friends, and she always seemed to show up when Mark was away. She'd stop by with a bottle of wine or text me about helping with event planning ideas. On the surface, it looked like kindness, the gesture of a lifelong friend keeping me company while my husband traveled. But her laughter had changed. It was louder, sharper, like she was trying to fill silence with something performative. More than once, I caught her steering conversations back toward Mark, asking about his trips or complimenting how he handled work stress. It struck me as odd, but I swallowed my doubts. I wanted to believe in her loyalty, because questioning her meant questioning everything. One evening, while Lily was upstairs finishing a paper for her history class, I sat at the dining table sorting through school documents. My phone buzzed with a message from Diane, a fellow counselor I trusted deeply. It read, "Elena, not sure if I should mention this, but I saw Mark and Tessa downtown last week. Looked like more than just friends." My hands froze above the papers, and I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. My heart didn't race the way I expected. Instead, a cool weight settled over me, heavy but steady. I typed back, "Thank you for telling me," and set the phone aside. That night, when Mark returned from another late dinner, I studied him quietly from across the living room. He dropped his keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, loosened his tie, and muttered about being exhausted. I asked if he'd been with Tessa. For a moment, the pause was almost imperceptible, but it was there like a crack in polished glass. "No, of course not," he said, shaking his head too quickly. "Why would you even ask that?" His denial was smooth, but the defensiveness in his eyes told another story. I didn't press further. Pressing would have given him the chance to twist the moment into another performance, and I wasn't ready to play the audience again. Instead, I began observing quietly, letting my silence carry more weight than questions. At dinners, I watched the way he scrolled through his phone, smiling at messages he didn't share. At parties, I noticed how Tessa's gaze lingered on him a fraction too long, how she angled her body toward him while pretending to talk to others. Even Lily, in her teenage bluntness, commented once, "Mom, why is Aunt Tessa always laughing at Dad's jokes? They're not even funny." I smiled weakly and told her not to worry, but inside, my resolve tightened. The first crack had become a fracture spreading through everything I thought was stable, and the strange part was how calm I felt. There was no screaming, no scenes, no desperate pleading for explanations. Instead, I moved through my days with an alertness I hadn't felt in years, as if every detail mattered now. I started keeping a notebook in my desk drawer at work, jotting down times dates and odd remarks. Nothing dramatic, just quiet records of things that didn't fit. I wasn't sure yet what I would do with it, but I knew I had to see the truth clearly before deciding how to act. The house itself seemed to carry the weight of change. The walls that had once echoed with laughter now absorbed long silences. Even dinners with Lily felt altered, her chatter about school and friends punctuated by the absence of Mark's usual presence. He was gone more often than not, and when he was home, his mind seemed elsewhere, his body moving through the house like a visitor rather than a husband. I learned to fill those absences with small rituals, late-night tea, long walks with the dog calls with Diane that ended with her gentle reminder, "Take care of yourself, Elena." But what truly shifted everything came one Saturday afternoon. Mark had left early, claiming he needed to meet a client for a last-minute meeting, and Lily was at rehearsal with her choir. I went to the grocery store, the kind of ordinary errand that usually brought comfort. As I walked past the wine aisle, I saw a familiar label, the same brand Tessa often brought over, and felt a cold clarity strike me. By the time I returned home, the suspicion was no longer a whisper. It was a certainty pressing against my chest. I placed the groceries on the counter and sat in the quiet kitchen, the ticking of the mantel clock echoing through the house, my hands folded in my lap, steady but cold, and I realized that the life I thought I was holding together was already breaking apart. I had no proof I could present, not yet, but I knew the cracks were real, and the deeper they spread, the closer I was to the moment when truth would no longer stay hidden. I didn't know then how far the betrayal would go, or how public it would become. I only knew that the fragrance of another woman's perfume had been the first spark, and now the fire was spreading, silent but unstoppable. The weight of suspicion became heavier with each passing week, and silence soon replaced the conversations that had once filled our home. Mark's voice, once steady and familiar, now arrived in fragments, short updates about work, vague explanations about his schedule, dismissive answers to questions that deserved more. When he was present, his body sat across from me, but his mind was elsewhere, wandering to a place I could not reach. At night, when I turned toward him, the distance between us was not measured in inches, but in miles, and the bed itself felt colder for it. I learned quickly that the loudest betrayals are often hidden beneath quiet routines. Mark still poured his coffee in the mornings, still set his briefcase by the door, still kissed Lily on the forehead as he left for work. But I noticed what was missing: the small gestures, the way his hand used to linger on my shoulder as he passed by, the way he once shared stories about his day without hesitation. He was going through the motions, keeping the frame of our life intact, while the picture inside had already begun to fade. Lily sensed it too, though she tried to hide her concern. One evening, as she finished her homework at the kitchen table, she asked Mom, "Is everything okay with you and Dad?" Her eyes carried the weight of a child who already knew the answer, but needed to hear something comforting. I smiled faintly, brushing a hand across her hair, and told her that sometimes parents go through difficult seasons. She accepted my words with the fragile trust of someone not yet old enough to question more deeply. After she went upstairs, I sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time, the ticking of the clock matching the slow ache in my chest. At work, I carried on as though nothing was amiss. I listened to students share their worries, helped them plan for college, and offered encouragement they desperately needed. Yet in the quiet moments when my office door was closed, I sometimes found myself staring out the window, lost in thought. Diane noticed my distraction one afternoon and gently asked if I was all right. I told her I was fine, though my voice lacked conviction. She didn't push, but her eyes said she knew better. I was grateful for her silence because I wasn't ready to give shape to what I was feeling. The pain of betrayal is not always sharp. Sometimes it is dull, lingering, stretching across the hours of a day like a shadow you can't step out of. I cried only once during that time. It was late at night, long after Mark had returned from another business dinner, and I sat on the edge of the bathtub with the shower running to drown out the sound. The tears came not from anger, but from the crushing loneliness of realizing the man I had built my life with was slowly slipping away. I pressed a towel to my face until my breathing calmed, then returned to bed without a word. In the weeks that followed, I began retreating inward, guarding myself in ways Mark never noticed. I stopped asking about his trips, stopped waiting up for him to come home, stopped filling the silence with conversation. Instead, I observed quietly, storing each inconsistency in the private ledger I kept in my mind. I began to understand that silence could be a form of power, a shield against the chaos he carried into our home. Tessa's presence only deepened the wound. She still visited now and then, always bringing her easy smile and stories about her work. She acted the part of the friend asking about Lily, offering to help with school events, pretending nothing had shifted. But her laughter was too bright, her compliments about Mark too casual, and her eyes carried a glimmer of something I couldn't ignore anymore. Each time she left, I felt the air in the house grow heavier, as if her perfume lingered long after the door closed behind her. I started journaling in the evenings, a habit I had abandoned years ago. The pages filled with quiet doubts, unanswered questions, and small details that seemed insignificant until they formed a pattern. The act of writing calmed me, allowing me to release the storm I carried inside without exposing it to the world. I didn't write about revenge or confrontation. I wasn't ready for that. What I wrote was grief, the grief of losing a man who was still alive, the grief of watching trust dissolve grain by grain. Through it all, Lily became my anchor. She was preparing for college auditions, filling the house with music as she practiced her pieces. Her voice carried strength I didn't feel, and her laughter reminded me that not everything in my life was broken. I poured my energy into her future, into making sure she felt secure even when my own footing was shaky. It was in those moments, listening to her sing, watching her study, that I remembered why I had to hold myself together, even if only by threads. The truth was beginning to show itself, though Mark still believed he was hiding it well. His stories became less convincing, his patience thinner, his presence more erratic. I no longer searched for explanations. Instead, I braced myself for the day when the truth would no longer come in whispers or traces of perfume, but would stand in front of me, undeniable. And as that day drew closer, the quiet suffering inside me began to transform into something else. A steady resolve, waiting for the moment it could no longer be contained. The moment of clarity came on a gray Thursday afternoon, the kind of day when the air feels heavy and even the light through the windows looks tired. I had just returned from school, carrying a stack of essays to grade, when Karen, our neighbor from across the street, walked up the path to my door. Her expression was cautious, the way someone looks when they're about to speak words that can't be unsaid. She asked if she could come in for a moment, and I led her into the kitchen, setting the papers aside. She hesitated, folding her hands together before finally saying, "Elena, I don't want to cause trouble, but I thought you should know. I saw Mark and Tessa at the bistro downtown last night. They weren't acting like friends." Her voice softened at the end, as though gentleness might soften the blow. I felt a sharp stillness move through me, but I managed to nod and thank her for telling me. After she left, the house seemed unnaturally quiet, every sound swallowed by the weight of her words. That night, when Mark came home later than usual, I sat at the kitchen table waiting. He walked in with his tie loose and the faintest trace of perfume clinging to his shirt. I asked him how the meeting had gone, and his answer came too fast, as if he had practiced it in the car. His eyes didn't quite meet mine as he spoke, and in that moment, I knew Karen hadn't been mistaken. The truth had stepped into my home, and no amount of denial could send it away. I didn't confront him then. Instead, I sat in silence, my hands folded tightly in my lap, watching him pour a drink as though nothing had changed. My silence was louder than any accusation. He glanced at me once, perhaps sensing something had shifted, but he said nothing. Later, when he fell asleep on the couch with the television flickering in the background, I stood in the doorway and studied him. The man I had trusted for so many years looked like a stranger wearing his skin. The next day, I decided I couldn't carry the truth alone any longer. During my lunch break at school, I closed the office door and called Diane. My voice was steady as I told her what Karen had seen, though inside, I felt a storm gathering. Diane listened quietly, then said, "Elena, you've known for a while. Now you just can't pretend anymore." Her words didn't sound harsh. They sounded like the truth, and the truth, no matter how painful, felt like a kind of relief. That weekend, I noticed how careless Mark had become. He left his phone on the counter while he went out to the garage, and the screen lit up with a message preview, "Can't wait until tonight. T." My heart didn't race this time. Instead, I picked up the phone and set it face down on the counter untouched. I didn't need to open it. The initials were enough. Proof wasn't what I lacked anymore. What I lacked was patience for the charade. I moved through the house differently after that. When Mark tried to tell me about his travel schedule, I listened politely, though my mind was elsewhere. When Tessa texted me asking if I wanted to meet for coffee, I declined with a simple, "Not this week." I no longer tried to patch over the cracks. Instead, I let them spread, knowing they would eventually bring everything down. One evening, Lily came into the living room while I was folding laundry. She sat beside me, her face serious, and asked, "Mom, is Dad mad at you?" "He always looks upset when you're around." I felt my throat tighten, but I smoothed her hair and told her gently that sometimes grown-ups struggle with things that have nothing to do with their children. She accepted the answer, but her eyes lingered on mine, searching for reassurance I could only partly give. That was the moment I realized the betrayal wasn't just between Mark and me. Its shadow was reaching Lily too, and that I could not allow. The turning point came when Mark and Tessa stopped hiding altogether. I drove past a small hotel on the edge of town one afternoon and saw his car parked outside. The sight should have shattered me, but instead, it steadied me. It was the final confirmation I had been waiting for, the undeniable proof that left no room for doubt. I drove home in silence, my hands steady on the wheel, and by the time I pulled into the driveway, I knew I could never go back to pretending. That night, I sat in the kitchen long after the dishes were washed and the house had gone quiet. I poured myself a cup of tea and stared at the steam rising in the lamplight. The grief I had carried for weeks had settled into something sharper, something that felt almost like clarity. I understood now that I couldn't change Mark's choices, but I could decide my own. When I finally went upstairs, I paused at Lily's door and listened to her humming softly as she studied. Her voice drifted into the hallway, steady and bright, reminding me that my life still held pieces worth protecting. I realized then that this was no longer just about betrayal. It was about reclaiming the strength I had given away, piece by piece, over the years. And with that realization came the quiet certainty that I would no longer stand in the shadows of their lies. The time had come to step forward, to see the truth clearly, and to prepare for what would come next. Once I accepted the truth of Mark's betrayal, my grief sharpened into something steadier. I no longer felt the need to search his phone or study his clothes. The silence between us had already spoken, and what it told me was enough. I began to carry myself differently in the house, no longer bending under the weight of his absences or his lies. On the surface, I kept my calm, but inside, I was quietly assembling the pieces of a plan that would protect me, protect Lily, and ensure that neither Mark nor Tessa could write the ending of this story for me. The first step came from a simple conversation with Diane. One afternoon, as we walked across the school parking lot, I told her plainly, "I'm ready to talk to someone." She nodded as though she had been waiting for me to say those words, and gave me the name of James Whitman, an attorney she trusted. His reputation was for quiet precision, not theatrics, and that was exactly what I needed. A week later, I sat across from him in his office, the blinds half drawn, my hands resting steadily on the table. I told him everything from the late nights to the neighbor's account, and finally about the message I had glimpsed on Mark's phone. James listened without interruption, his pen moving across the page, and when I finished, he said, "You've been patient long enough. We'll proceed carefully but firmly." That meeting changed the way I moved through my days. At home, I acted as though nothing had shifted, keeping my tone, even my routines intact, my presence steady for Lily's sake. But behind the calm, I was taking deliberate steps. James advised me to secure important documents, so I spent quiet afternoons gathering bank statements, insurance policies, and property records, slipping them into a folder I kept at school rather than at home. I opened a separate account in my name, depositing my paycheck there from that point forward. Each small action was a thread pulled from the fabric of my marriage, loosening it in ways Mark couldn't see. Mark, absorbed in his double life, seemed unaware of the changes. He still came home late, his excuses practiced and thin, and he still carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he held the upper hand. I let him. My silence became my shield, and my composure the one thing he couldn't rattle. On evenings when he grew short-tempered, I answered with calm replies, never raising my voice. He mistook it for indifference, perhaps even weakness, but in truth, it was the ground beneath my feet growing firmer. Tessa, too, continued her performance of friendship, sending texts about coffee dates and community events. I declined more often than not, offering simple excuses about being busy at school. When I did see her at neighborhood gatherings, I greeted her politely but kept my distance. She laughed a little too loudly, her eyes flitting toward Mark with a brightness she couldn't hide. I noticed the way others began to watch them as well, their glances quick but telling. I said nothing, and the silence around us only deepened. Walter, my father-in-law, came by one Saturday morning to drop off some tools for Mark. As we stood in the driveway, he studied me with the kind of gaze that sees more than words can cover. "You're holding up," he said quietly. I nodded, not trusting myself to say more. There was no need to drag him into what his son had chosen, but his steady presence reminded me that not everyone in this family would betray me. That gave me strength I didn't know I needed. In the evenings after Lily went to bed, I would sit at the kitchen table with my notebook. I wrote down each step I had taken, each document secured, each detail recorded. It wasn't revenge, yet it was preparation. The act of writing steadied me, reminded me that I wasn't adrift, that I was moving with purpose toward a future that belonged to me, not to their deception. The grief that had once consumed me was now fuel, and with each page, I felt more certain of the path I was on. The breaking point came sooner than I expected. One night, Mark came home later than usual, his tie askew, his eyes carrying the weariness of someone who had been drinking. He stood in the doorway, staring at me as though expecting a fight. "You've been cold lately," he said, his tone sharp. I met his gaze and answered softly, "I've been paying attention." He frowned, confused by my calm, but I didn't elaborate. Instead, I turned back to the papers I had been grading my pen, moving steadily across the page. His anger flared briefly, then faltered, as if my composure left him with nothing to push against. That night, as I lay awake listening to his uneven breathing beside me, I understood something vital I didn't need to shout, or accuse, or plead. The power I sought wasn't in making him admit the truth. It was in preparing myself for the day when the truth would stand on its own. Every quiet step I took, every document filed away, every dollar set aside, was part of a foundation he couldn't see until it was too late. When Sunday came, I took Lily out for breakfast, just the two of us. Over pancakes and coffee, I told her how proud I was of her music, how much I believed in her. She smiled, her eyes bright, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. I realized then that my revenge wasn't just about Mark or Tessa. It was about building a life where Lily and I could breathe freely, unbound by lies. And so I moved forward quietly, steadily, deliberately. The cracks in my marriage had become a fracture, but I no longer feared the collapse. I was ready for it, I was preparing for it. And when it came, I intended to be standing strong with everything I needed in place. The unraveling came to a head on a night that should have been unremarkable. Mark had promised to attend Lily's choir recital, something she had worked toward for months. She had asked him twice that morning if he would be there, and he had assured her he wouldn't miss it. But when the lights dimmed and the students walked onto the stage, his seat beside me stayed empty. I sat with Walter, who clapped with pride for his granddaughter, while Lily's eyes searched the audience, once then settled with quiet disappointment. The silence in that empty chair was louder than any argument we could have had at home. After the concert, as families gathered in the lobby with flowers and cameras, I held Lily close, telling her how beautifully she had sung. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Walter placed a hand on my shoulder, his face tight with frustration, and muttered, "He had no excuse for this." I didn't reply. The hurt was already clear, and words would only make it heavier. We drove home with the programs folded neatly in my bag, the silence between us sharper than the winter air outside. When Mark finally walked in later that night, his expression shifted as he saw the untouched dinner plates still on the counter. What he asked, shrugging off his coat. "I told you the client meeting ran long." His voice was defensive before I even said a word. I didn't raise mine. I simply asked, "Which client?" His answer came too fast, the name tumbling out with no details behind it. For the first time, I let my silence linger, my gaze steady on his. He grew irritated, accusing me of doubting him, of making things harder than they needed to be. Lily had already gone upstairs, so I let him rage into the empty air. When he realized I wasn't responding, he slammed his briefcase onto the table and stormed into the study. The confrontation I had been preparing for finally arrived the next evening. We were invited to a neighborhood dinner at the community center, one of those gatherings where everyone brought a dish and shared stories at long tables. I knew Tessa would be there. I hadn't seen her in weeks, not since Karen's quiet warning, but I felt a calm determination as I set a casserole on the serving table and took my seat. Sure enough, they arrived together, though they made a clumsy attempt at pretending they hadn't. Mark lingered by the drinks table, laughing at something she said, while her hand rested just a little too comfortably on his arm. Conversations around us slowed. Neighbors exchanged glances, their expressions guarded but curious. It wasn't just me noticing anymore. I caught Karen's eye across the room. She gave me the smallest nod, a silent acknowledgement of what we both knew. When Mark finally joined me at the table, his smile was too wide, his tone too bright. "You should have tried the wine Tessa brought," he said, as though nothing in the world was amiss. My fork stilled above my plate. I met his gaze, steady and calm, and replied, "No, I think I'll pass." The quiet that followed spread outward, a ripple of awareness through the table. Tessa shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her laugh thin and strained. It was Walter who broke the silence. His voice, usually warm, carried a sharp edge. "Mark, do you think people don't see what's going on? You're making a fool of yourself and of this family." The room hushed, eyes turning toward us. Mark's face flushed red, his jaw tightening. He muttered something about everyone minding their own business, but the damage was already done. The words hung in the air, undeniable. Later that night, when we returned home, the storm broke. Mark slammed the front door and turned on me, his voice raised. "How dare you let your father humiliate me like that?" His anger filled the room, sharp and reckless. I stood in the doorway, hands steady, and said, "You humiliated yourself." I didn't have to say a word. My calmness only fueled his fury, but it also drained the power from his threats. For the first time, he couldn't twist the story to make me the villain. He paced the living room, running his hands through his hair, his words turning frantic. "You'll regret this, Elena. You don't know what you're starting." I stepped closer, lowering my voice until it cut through his shouting. "No, Mark. You don't know what I've already started." His eyes narrowed, but the confidence behind them faltered. He realized then that I wasn't afraid anymore, and that scared him more than anything else could. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in months. The confrontation had come, and instead of breaking me, it had shown me the strength I carried. The cracks in our marriage were now visible to everyone, and Mark could no longer hide behind polished lies. He had wanted freedom, but what he found instead was exposure. As I lay in bed listening to the quiet hum of the house, I knew this was only the beginning. The real reckoning hadn't arrived yet, but the stage was set and I was ready for it. After the scene at the community dinner, there was no way to patch the illusion back together. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, and whispers began at Mark's office as well. He tried to carry on with the same polished charm he had always relied on. But people's smiles grew tighter and their eyes less trusting. I stayed quiet. I had no need to explain or defend myself. Silence. I learned allowed the truth to walk on its own legs. James worked methodically filing the necessary papers with the court while keeping me updated in calm, measured tones. He explained how Mark's abandonment and infidelity would weigh heavily in the proceedings. I listened, asked questions, and provided the documentation I had collected. Each time I handed him another folder, bank records, text logs, photographs, I felt a strange lightness, as though I was setting down burdens one by one. Mark had believed his secrecy gave him power, but it was his carelessness that had armed me with evidence. The first sign of his world collapsing came in the form of financial strain. With accounts divided and access restricted, he found himself scrambling. He called one evening, his voice urgent, asking me to release funds just until his next commission check came through. I let the phone ring and fall silent. The next day, a curt email arrived from his lawyer, filled with demands and accusations. James's response was simple and unshakable, attaching proof of Mark's affair and abandonment. There was no reply after that. Meanwhile, Tessa faced her own unraveling. Her business depended on reputation, on the image of a woman who could plan flawless events and carry herself with grace. But as word spread of her involvement with a married man, our neighbor, no less clients, began to withdraw. One by one, contracts slipped away, and I heard from Karen that she was struggling to keep her staff. The same laugh that once filled rooms now sounded brittle, a defense against the whispers she couldn't silence. At home, Mark grew restless. He tried to reassert control through sudden bursts of anger. One night, he confronted me in the driveway after Lily had gone inside. His face was tight with desperation. "You think you've won, don't you?" he spat. I looked at him steadily and replied, "I didn't need to win, Mark. You lost all on your own." His shoulders sagged at those words, the fight draining from him, and for the first time, I saw the full extent of his fear. It wasn't about losing me, it was about losing the life he thought he controlled. Walter remained a quiet pillar throughout. He stopped by often, fixing small things around the house, never pressing for details, but always leaving me with the sense that I wasn't alone. One afternoon, as he tightened a loose hinge on the back door, he said softly, "Your strength reminds me of your mother. Don't let anyone take that from you." His words settled deep inside me, a reminder that dignity wasn't loud. It was steady, unshaken, even in the face of betrayal. The legal process moved faster than I expected. When the first hearing came, I walked into the courthouse with James by my side, my documents neatly organized. Mark sat across the aisle, looking older than his years. His suit wrinkled, his expression worn. Tessa was not there, though her absence spoke volumes. The judge listened as James laid out the case: abandonment, infidelity, financial misconduct. Each piece of evidence was precise, irrefutable. Mark's lawyer stumbled through objections, but they carried little weight. The room felt heavy with the inevitability of it all. Outside the courthouse, as reporters from the local paper lingered nearby, Mark tried once more to corner me. His words came in a rush, half plea, half threat. "We can work this out quietly. Don't drag me through the mud." I met his gaze steady and calm and said, "You did that yourself." Then I turned and walked away, my heels striking the pavement with a clarity that echoed in the autumn air. The weeks that followed sealed the outcome. Mark moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, the kind of place he once would have dismissed as beneath him. Tessa's business continued to falter, and she grew more isolated as friends and clients slipped away. Together, they had imagined a grand new life, but what they found instead was a narrow, shrinking world. For Lily, I did my best to keep life steady. She focused on her music, preparing applications for college, and I made sure the house remained a place of peace for her. One evening after dinner, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "I'm glad you didn't let him break you." Tears stung my eyes, but I only nodded, holding her close. In that moment, I knew everything I had endured was worth it, not for revenge alone, but for the strength it showed her. By the time the final negotiations were near, Mark and Tessa were shadows of the people who once stood so boldly beside me. Their laughter had quieted, their confidence dimmed. I hadn't needed to shout, to humiliate, or to strike back. All I had done was step aside and let the truth surface. And the truth relentless, as the tide had swept their illusions away. The collapse of their world was almost complete, but there was still one last step to take, one final act that would bring everything to a close. The final judgment came on a crisp winter morning, sunlight spilling across the courthouse steps as I walked inside with James. By then, the case was more a formality than a battle. The evidence had been clear, the truth undeniable. Mark's lawyer made one last attempt to argue for fairness, but fairness had already spoken. The court awarded me the house, my share of the assets, and most importantly, the right to close this chapter with dignity intact. When the gavel fell, I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was steady, like the ground had finally stopped shifting beneath me. Mark sat slouched across the aisle, his tie loose, his eyes heavy with defeat. He didn't look at me, and I didn't expect him to. Tessa was nowhere in sight. Their world, once so full of noise and show, had collapsed into silence. That evening, Lily and I unpacked takeout containers at the kitchen table. The same table that had witnessed countless quiet doubts now held a different weight piece. She told me about an upcoming audition, her voice animated, her eyes bright. I realized in that moment how much stronger she had grown through all of this. She had seen betrayal, yes, but she had also seen resilience. The example I had set wasn't one of breaking apart, but of holding steady until the storm passed. Walter stopped by a few days later with a bag of groceries and a bouquet of flowers, simple but thoughtful. He stood in the doorway, taking in the freshly painted walls and the warmth that had returned to the house. "It feels lighter in here," he said softly. I nodded, knowing he wasn't just talking about the colors. His quiet support had been a lifeline, and I would always be grateful for that. As weeks turned into months, I rebuilt piece by piece. I rearranged furniture, planted new flowers in the yard, and filled the living room with music and books, instead of tension and silence. Each change was small, but together they formed a new beginning. The house, once a stage for betrayal, became a sanctuary again. Not perfect, not untouched, but wholly mine. I no longer checked for updates on Mark or Tessa. Their story was theirs to live with, not mine to follow. What mattered was that I had reclaimed my own. The grief had long since cooled into something steadier, a quiet strength I could carry forward. I didn't need revenge to define me. What defined me was the choice to rise above their chaos, to build something lasting out of the pieces they had tried to break. Looking back, I see now that betrayal doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it begins with a faint trace of perfume, a silence that lingers too long, a chair left empty when it matters most. But I also see that dignity doesn't announce itself loudly either. It comes in the steady steps of protecting yourself, in the quiet courage to let the truth surface, and in the resolve to build a life beyond the storm. Tonight, as I sit in the same kitchen where it all began, the air feels different. There is no heaviness, no waiting for the sound of a door closing too late. There is only calm. I think of the woman I was when this began, the one who doubted herself, who tried to explain away the cracks. I carry her still, but I also carry the strength she found in the fire. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most deeply to you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.